And we are live. Hello, everybody. Eric Bischoff here, in one of our first of 4 episodes, a four-part series on a brand new book that's coming out next Tuesday, I believe. We'll get some more information on that in just a few moments. Called The Six Pack by Brad Balukjian. Did I say that right, Brad? Your name is harder to say than mine.
It is really hard. Balukjian, but I put a pronunciation guide in the book this time so people can actually know.
That's excellent, Brad. Thanks so much for doing this, brother. I've been really looking forward to this, and I'm really excited about the 4 episodes we're going to do, because your book is so phenomenal. And for me, it was, and I don't read recreationally. I read a lot for information, but recreationally, it's just not my thing. I just don't do it. My wife, she gets up in the morning early, and she'll lay in bed and read for an hour, hour and a half before she gets up.
Right.
And starts moving about. She'll do the same thing at night before she goes to sleep. She'll read for an hour, hour and a half recreationally. I only read for information. But when I read your book, in a weird way, I felt like it was in a movie. It was such a cool thing because of the way you wrote. Your style of writing is very, very cinematic.
Well, thanks, man. I like to say with my books that my goal is to inform and also to entertain. And so, I'm glad that you picked up on that, because I like to think that the techniques that I use in my books are the same techniques that are used in writing fiction and writing novels, right? Being able to describe a scene, being able to include dialogue. And so if you got that out of it, then I definitely hit my mark.
Yeah, that was the first impression. And, I think, halfway through the first chapter, I was like, wow, this should be a movie or maybe a TV series based on the book. And we'll talk about that later on, of course, probably in episode 4.
Yeah.
Adventure. But let's back up a little bit. And honestly, thankfully you sent me some notes to kind of keep me on track, because anybody that listens to me on the podcast or anything else I do knows that I just go off in tangents and sometimes forget what I'm talking about. But but I can't even remember, how did you and I first come across each other?
Yeah, so I listened to some of your shows. This is probably back maybe 4 years ago, listening to 83 Weeks. And just the way you described your philosophy, how you look at storytelling and what you think makes a good story. And the more I listened to you, the more I was like, this guy just understands the basics of story. And that's really what I am as a writer and a journalist, as a storyteller. And so I just had this instinct that, even though I didn't think you were necessarily a baseball fan, I thought, I knew you did TV, you produce shows. So I thought maybe Eric Bischoff would like this book, The Wax Pack, which was my first book, which was about tracking down all the guys in a pack of 1986 baseball cards. And so I reached out to maybe Conrad, and he gave me your email. And, I'll always be grateful that you don't know me at all, but I just sent you a cold email giving you a little pitch about my book, and you said, hey, yeah, let's have a conversation. And that just got us going, talking about the Wax Pack and, maybe adapting that for TV or movie. And, we tried a few options there. And then I got into my next book idea, and I said, well, Eric, I think you're going to like this one. I think this topic may resonate with you a little bit.
Let's before we get into the Six Pack, and I love the fact that you're kind of creating a franchise, a pack franchise. That's awesome.
Right.
But before we get into the Six Pack, and that's what we're here to talk about, briefly describe to us how Wax Pack came about. Give us the origin story of your first book.
Yeah, well, I guess you could say that I don't know what it says about me, but like the things that I liked when I was 6 years old, I'm here in my childhood home in Rhode Island right now, and so I liked baseball cards. I like wrestling. I'm 43, so I grew up in the 80s, and like a lot of us of that age, these are things we can all relate to. And I always wondered, with all those baseball cards that I had as a kid, what happened to these guys when they were done playing? Like they just kind of disappear. And so I said, hey, what a neat idea to structure a book around just getting a single pack of baseball cards that had never been opened. And whoever's in that pack, those are the guys that I would go on a massive road trip all over the country to go track down and find. And it just became this, it evolved into this story that was really about fathers and sons and vulnerability and growing up. And I think that's kind of the common thread between the Wax Pack and the Six Pack is these books are really about humanity and about people, right? It's not about baseball statistics or, wrestling storylines per se, as much as it is like, who are the people behind these public personas?
And with Wax Pack, how long were you on the road? Because you jumped in your car, and I'm not going to get into your personal life, but if I remember correctly, and a relationship ended, and that
to be
hard.
fair, that book was pretty personal, and I talked about my relationship, and breakups, and so it was a little bit more of my own personal story. But yeah, I drove 11,341 miles one summer over 7 weeks to go find all these baseball players. And so it's the story of that road trip, along with the story of the players and the story of, kind of what I'm learning from the guys that were my heroes as a kid.
How old were you when you did your research for Wax Pack?
I was 34 on that road trip. So, firmly mid 30s. For the Six Pack, I was 41. So, getting into my 40s now for the next one.
Very cool. And one more time before we get into the book itself, because I want the audience to get to know you, because I think you're a pretty fascinating dude in your own right. You're an author, but that's not really your day job, right? Or at least it wasn't up until recently.
Right. It's getting to be now, but yeah, I have a weird career where I'm a scientist, I'm a professor. I discovered all these species of insects that live in Tahiti, and had an amazing time living in Tahiti. So I have a whole nother side, which is the science and teaching part. But and I've written a lot about science, but I've just gotten on this track now of writing about 1980s nostalgia and former athletes. And I've always I have a background in journalism. My first job out of college was working for a magazine, and so I've always kind of had these two different interests in writing and in science.
That's so crazy. The reason I love it is because I think you're a representative of what I want people to know about professional wrestling, because as someone that's been in the business, on the business side of it, not as a wrestler, but on the business side of things, you come across so many people who have a perception of who a wrestling fan is, or what a wrestling fan is. And I try to tell people all the time that, we got people that listen to 83 Weeks and reach out to me on social media. I've got one guy who's a lawyer, and, he argues cases in front of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
We got a rocket scientist, a legitimate, kind of like a baby Elon Musk, but a legitimate rocket scientist. That's a huge fan. It's wrestling fans, I think, represent a far more diverse group of people than sometimes people give wrestling credit for. So you're a testament to the quality of the wrestling fan that I know is out there, and hopefully we'll get more of them that'll come out of the closet and not be afraid to talk about the fact that, hey, I grew up a wrestling fan and I still dig it. Because a lot of people, they treat wrestling like porn. It's like, I really, I watch it, but I'm not going to tell anybody I watch it. I'm not going to do that.
No, 100%. Yeah. There's a lot of people. I think that stigma is changing, thankfully. But yeah, historically, it's definitely something. I wasn't exactly, rushing into my PhD advisor's office to ask her if she watched Monday Night Raw.
And what was the reaction of your friends and family and people close to you when you said, I know I'm a scientist, and, I'm a journalist, and, I'm a professor at a university, and I think I'm going to write a book about wrestling and kind of take some time off my job and jump in a car. And how many miles did you drive to do the research for Six Pack?
This one was 12,545. So a little bit more. And plus I flew to Puerto Rico. So that's another part of it.
What kind of car did you drive?
It's right out back. It's a 2012 Ford Fusion. With, if anyone can fix my air conditioning, please come to Rhode Island.
Or if you're a representative of Ford and you work in the marketing and advertising division, here's a guy that traveled the country in his Ford, doing wrestling interviews. So,
but to answer your question, Eric, I think I set the tone pretty early in my life that let's put it this way: when I was 5, and this will segue us into the book. I'm 5 years old, growing up in Rhode Island here, going to the Providence Civic Center. And this is like 1985. And I had a really shrill, high voice as a kid up in the nosebleeds. And I'm the lone voice screaming, cheering for the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov at a time when, no one is cheering for the heels back then, or especially not for the Iron Sheik, right? So I think my family and my friends, they always knew, like, hey, Brad's just different. Brad's going to do what Brad wants to do. And so, when I said, hey, I'm going to go, write this crazy baseball book or this wrestling book, there, to my parents' credit, they were like, we love you. Follow your passion and do what you want to do.
That's awesome. Awesome. So, all right, let's jump into your newest adventure, Six Pack. What's the book about? Tell us what it's about.
And we have some, I know we have some great images that Dave Stubble gonna pull up for us too, to just kind of walk us through this. Okay, Six Pack is, so I have this crazy backstory with the Iron Sheik. Khosrow Vaziri is his real name. And we'll probably call him Kaz during this. And like I said, he was my favorite wrestler as a kid. So I've always been someone, and maybe this is why I'm a journalist. Like, it's not enough for me to like somebody. I want to get to know everything about them. I want to understand them, what makes them tick. So when I was in college, and I was, this is early internet days. And I remember I was looking up on probably America Online or something, the Iron Sheik. And at this point, this is like maybe 2000. So he was well past his prime. He's wrestling in front of 100 people or doing an autograph signing. And I had this long-term plan. Like, this is a good advertisement for long-term planning, where I got to know his agent, a guy named Eric Sims, who represented him. And I spent about a year building a relationship with Eric Sims, like through like instant messenger. I even went down to Wildwood, New Jersey to spend a weekend with Eric Sims just to get to know him. And that led to, building some trust, where at some point he said, okay, well, I'll invite you down when the Iron Sheik's in town and you can meet him. So I go down to Secaucus, New Jersey for like some Comic Con or something. I'm 20 years old in my 93 Ford Escort. And I go in, and there's Kaz, there's the Iron Sheik, and he's sitting in an Oldsmobile chugging a Molson Ice, in all of his costume and his gimmick. And I wrote about this in the book by the first day I met. In fact, I think if Silva can pull up some photos, that's the first day I met the Iron Sheik. This is at the Holiday Inn in Secaucus, New Jersey. There's a couple other photos there of that. First there is me and the Molson Ice. And that day I just started like going off about everything I knew about the Iron Sheik. And I had done my homework. I knew, I had researched him. And I think he's a guy that really respects people that have done their homework. He always was impressed by people that were well educated. So I think I just kind of impressed him with all this knowledge I had about his career, because that first day he ends up saying, hey, come stay with me in the hotel. We went out to a diner at 5 a.m, and he's stoned out of his mind, and we go in there. He's got a fistful of Sharpies and 8x10 glossies, and he starts signing autographs for all these people in the bar. And he goes, Brad Bubba, whatever you want, you order. And so I order some food, and then he starts signing autographs. And at the end, he goes to the people, oh, okay, I sign autograph, you pay for my bill. He walked out of the diner. That was my first day with the Iron Sheik, and that led to me actually building a friendship with him over several years, where I then, fast forward several years, left my job at a magazine to go live near him in Fayetteville, Georgia. This is in 2005, and to write his biography. And so now we get the first line of the book, The Six Pack, is the Iron Sheik just threatened to kill me. And it's because what happened when I got there in 2005 was I had no idea just how deep into the addiction he was. And it became clear that, there wasn't going to be a book being written at that point. So we parted ways. I went back to California, went on with my life. And then it wasn't until a few years ago, now after I met you, Eric, and I started thinking about a second book idea, I said, let's go back to the Iron Sheik story. Let's finish that story to play off the current storylines in WWE. And so I said, I'm not only going to find the Iron Sheik again, I'm going to find 6 guys that were on the show in Madison Square Garden, December 26, 1983, when he became the champion. And those are the guys that I'm going to track down to tell the story of how the WWF expanded, but also looking at how, how much did these guys become their characters? And that's what this book really is about. It's about truth. It's about fact checking all these stories that have been in wrestling mythology. It's about myth versus reality and identity. Yeah, there you go. First day. I didn't sell the camel clutch very well. You can see me smiling. Like,
oh, dude, I'm surprised you didn't break you in half.
Yeah. So yeah, that's that first day I met him. So the book was this road trip to go find Hulk Hogan and Tony Atlas and Tito Santana and Sergeant Slaughter and Bill Eadie and Iron Sheik, and to write a book that I hope, Eric, this book is different from any other wrestling book, because it's a lot of wrestling books are either like biographies or they're, meticulously researched stories of wrestling. Like Guy Evans' book is a fantastic book about, all this research into WCW. My book has a lot of research, but it's also like I'm kind of the proxy for the reader, right? I want the reader to be able to experience this through my eyes. So I actually write about going on the road and meeting these guys and being in their houses and doing things with them so that the readers can kind of be in my shoes.
Interesting that you brought up Guy Evans, because I have so much respect for him. His book, Nitro, the amount of research that he did, and I think probably makes Nitro one of the better books out there about the business of the wrestling business, because Guy spent the time, he did the work. I mean, it's grueling. You know better than I do, obviously. It's grueling to do a great job at the research. But if you don't do the research, the end product is going to be flimsy at best. How many people did you interview for this book?
Over 50 people. It wasn't just the wrestlers. It was, Sergeant Slaughter's high school football coach and, somebody that was in Bill Eadie's high school class, or the Iron Sheik's wife, Hulk Hogan's, the guy that carried Hulk, that had his Hulk steroids delivered to his house for him. I mean, it was like all these different people that intersected with these wrestlers.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, because it's been a couple of months now, so I read the book, but you actually went to Hulk Hogan's childhood home and you talked to the guy that lives there now, right?
I literally found the address, knocked on the door on like a Tuesday morning, and the house, he's renovated it, but it's still there. It's Port Tampa. The guy happened to be home, took me inside, like showed me, okay, that's where Terry's bedroom was, and it was incredible. It was a lot of good luck in that sense as well.
Did he let you take pictures?
He would have. I don't think I did. I mean, on the outside of the house. And so when we do the Hogan episode, we'll show some of those.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious. But as long as I've known Hulk and we've been friends, I've never driven past his childhood home. But that's the kind of thing I like to do. So I'll be interested in that.
Yeah. Well, and when you want to understand a person, going to the place where they're from and talking to people and just describing the environment, provide, this is your thing, right? Context, right? You have to build context for when you're evaluating someone and their legacy or who they are. You really need to do a good job of establishing that context. And part of that meant, okay, I need to go to Port Tampa. I need to go talk to people that knew Terry when he was a kid, when he was getting into rock music and that sort of thing.
In addition to us learning, and we're going to talk a lot about the first chapter, and there's a lot to talk about with Iron Sheik. And I said this today in the little video that I did promoting what we're doing tonight, that, I've been in, I don't consider myself in the wrestling business any longer, but I did spend, 32, 33 years actively in the business at a lot of different levels, from being a grunt, selling syndication and learning how to be a producer and everything else involved. I thought I had heard every wrestling story out there about just about everybody, and especially with Sheik. I thought, man, I have heard so many Sheik stories in the past 30 some odd years of being associated with the industry, that I was confident that I'd heard every one.
Yeah.
Until I read your book.
Well,
there's a lot of stuff in there that I've never heard before. What did you find the most interesting what's the one thing, if you can find one thing about what you've learned about Sheik in your research and in the time you spent with him when you were drinking Molson Ice, which, by the way, has the highest alcohol content of just about any beer out there, which I'm sure is why Sheik was drinking it, because wrestlers know where to find alcohol content.
That's what he told me as soon as I met him, was this is why I'm drinking this.
It's funny how I know that shit, isn't it? It's just crazy. Yeah. What is the one thing, if there is one thing, what surprised you the most about Sheik?
Maybe that he didn't really hate Terry, didn't really hate Hogan. Like so much of this stuff that was made of their rivalry of him hating the stuff he said on Howard Stern and Brian Blair and all that, and going off on Hulk. That was so much of a work in the later part of his career. And I think what was nice to see at the end of what ended up being the end of his life, when I went to visit him in Fayetteville, was to see how he had come full circle. Right. And so just to know that this is a guy who, when he was in Iran, he's from, he grew up in a small town called Damghan, Iran, moved to Tehran when he was about 5, didn't have electricity where he grew up. And his whole dream was to be an amateur wrestling star. And there was a famous Olympian in Iran named Takhti that everyone worshipped. And the Iron Sheik, Khosrow Vaziri, just wanted to be like him. And, as has been reported, Kaz was, if we could pull up some of the pictures of Kaz when he was, so so some of the things that I got, some of the documents I got. This is the Iron Sheik in elementary school.
And he looks like a badass in elementary school. He looks like he could kick a 25-year-old guy's ass.
I know. I was able to get his report cards and his early. So there he is, probably in high school. Good looking guy. You see that dimple in his chin, and so we can just roll through a few of these. That was the guy Takhti, who was his hero, who was an Iranian. He was kind of like the national hero of Iran as an Olympic wrestler. Everyone wanted to be like him. And Iron Sheik actually, Kaz got to know this guy personally, became friends with him. Here he is in the military. So, whenever Kaz would talk about, being in the military or working for the Iranian TV station, all of that was true. He was legitimately in those things. And then there's a bunch of other documents here we can show that this is like his actual papers from when he was in the National Iranian Wrestling Federation as an amateur. And all these documents that show, here's when he competed in European tournaments. He was a star wrestler. Here's his report card, which and I'm going to share all this material as part of my website. But if you study this closely, what's funny is his best subject was physical education and discipline, which might not be a surprise. Not so good in math and physics, I don't think. More of his wrestling documents from in Farsi and all that. So just to show that he's a guy that he had this whole life before he was the Iron Sheik. And when he came to the United States, he didn't speak any English. He came over here and he just knew the name of one person, a guy named Alan Rice from Minnesota. And, he gets on a plane from Iran and he comes to the US, and he's literally walking around the airport in Minneapolis, just saying this one name, Alan Rice, because it's this wrestling coach that he had met at a tournament who said, if you ever come to the US, come look me up. And that's how he started in Minnesota as a coach for the US Olympic team. And so, all this, here he is, like when people have said, Iron Sheik, was he at the Olympics? Well, here he is in 1972 in Munich, Germany, at the Olympics. He didn't compete, but he wanted to. He was just ineligible because he had, moved to the US and he couldn't compete for the US.
Uh-oh. David, we still got him. Is it me or is it him?
What's that?
Oh, we lost you for just a second.
Oh, okay. No, I'm here.
All right. We got you back.
So yeah, so yeah, that all this backstory that he had, that was so this is all to say that this is why, the Iron Sheik, he really was a very serious guy. He took himself very seriously. He had a lot of pride in what a good amateur wrestler he was, and I think that's why it was so sad later on when all the drug stuff started coming in.
Alan Rice, for probably 99.9% of the audience that's listening to this who's never heard of Alan Rice, but Alan Rice was a legendary wrestling coach at the University of Minnesota, legendary coach. And of course, Vern Gagne wrestled at the University of Minnesota, supported amateur wrestling long after he was done with it. And that relationship is probably how, I'm guessing, and I can't remember how it came about in the book, but I'm guessing that's how Kaz came across Vern Gagne. And I think it was Vern that trained Kaz. Am I right?
Yeah. So, Kaz, he comes in and he's, I was able to find the guys that he trained. Some of the guys, like Dan Chandler and Pat Marcy. These are Olympic U.S. wrestlers that Kaz trained in Minnesota. And one of them was a tree trimmer. And so Kaz, he was used to, in Iran, they would actually pay for the wrestlers' expenses. And now he's in the United States. He's just trying to learn English. He's doesn't have any money. He doesn't really know what he's going to do. And so he at one point he says to the guy he was training, "Hey, maybe I should just be a tree trimmer." I mean, imagine how the history of wrestling changes if the Iron Sheik, just becomes a tree trimmer instead of going and becoming a professional wrestler. But what he ends up doing is he sees wrestling on TV, and there is no professional wrestling in Iran, right? It doesn't exist. It's just, he didn't know anything about it. So when he started watching wrestling in Minnesota and AWA, he was like, well, what is this? And obviously he knew that he wasn't a shoot. But then he says, he saw all the Cadillacs that were parked in the parking lot. And as he famously told some of his friends, he's like, you can't eat a gold medal. And so, basically saying that, hey, I need to make some money and I need to figure it out. And so he basically begged Alan Rice to introduce him to Vern Gagne. And that gets us to the famous camp, right, where he trains with Ken Patera and Ric Flair, and Bob Bruggers, and and Jim Brunzell.
Jim is a great guy. Did you had a chance to talk to Jim, didn't you?
I did. I interviewed Jim, and Jim was telling me about how he felt like a lot of the guys took advantage of Kaz in that camp, because Kaz was probably the toughest, the best wrestler of that group. But I think he had the hardest time adjusting to the pro style, right? Because he was used to, wrestling it's a shoot. It's Greco-Roman. It's all this stuff. And so learn the idea of letting someone, hurt you or pretend, to do a move to you was so foreign to him. And he said that a lot of guys they would kind of play jokes on him or kind of take liberties with him, like Billy Robinson and I think Greg Gagne sometimes. And so, I think Jim kind of felt for Kaz because he knew he was having a hard time, getting into the business. And I think there's a couple photos here of what he looked like, when he was first breaking in. That's like Iron Sheik as a rookie, right? And he's just starting out.
He just looks like somebody that could rip you limb from limb. That must have been a hell of a transition when you think about it. Number one, culturally, you're coming over from an entirely different culture. It's not like you're coming over from another country. There's a lot of countries, especially in Europe, Western countries, essentially, the language is different, but the food's a little bit different, but pretty much you can figure it out pretty quickly. But coming from a place like Iran or Japan, where you don't even know the language and you don't have any relationships, you don't have anybody to help you out. You jumped on a plane, you came in with what's in your bag in a dream. This really is, the American dream, isn't it?
Well, and that's why the ultimate irony of here's the Iron Sheik playing the evil foreigner, evil Iranian, right? the irony is that this guy is the most American loving guy of all the people that I interviewed, right? Iron Sheik loved America more than anybody that I covered. And because of what you're saying, he came here with nothing, and he believed in the American dream, and he achieved it, right? I mean, he really built himself into this household name, starting out from nothing. And so I remember when I interviewed his daughter, one of his daughters, Nikki, about, I was like, what was it like growing up? Because Kaz would tell his daughters, it's like, don't tell your friends at school who I am, because they might try to hurt you, right? Because this is in the 80s, when kayfabe was still in full effect, and people did nasty shit they were slashing his tires, they were putting sugar in his gas tank. His wife Carol told me that they called in death threats a few times in the Boston Garden, and he had to, he had to stay off the show. So I was wondering, did this really affect he had three daughters, and what was it like as a little girl when your dad's the Iron Sheik? And she said that, no, that they knew how much, even from a very young age, they knew how much he loved America. And so they knew this was all just a character that he was portraying on TV. But out in public in the world, it was pretty real a lot of the time when he's being, accosted by people, and, people thinking he's actually this evil guy.
I obviously didn't know him back then, but did you get a sense from the people that you interviewed, what kind of guy was he? Was he a gentle person? Was he fairly aggressive outside of the ring? Get any sense of what he was really like just as a person before he became famous?
Yeah, I think Kaz, super disciplined, super hardworking, intense, serious, kind of rigid, but also just so committed to whatever he was doing. And there's this word in Farsi the word is Javan Mardi, and it basically means like respect and chivalry. And that was all that he cared about, was like, and I remember even later on in his years when I met him, he would take these hour-long showers, and he would be like fastidiously cleaning himself and, spraying cologne all over himself. He'd always talk about needing to be clean and needing to have good manners and to be respectful. And that's why when the version we saw of him on Howard Stern was so strange, right? Especially to the people that really knew him as a person, like, who is this guy, this lunatic that's ranting and raving and saying all these horrible things? Because the real Khosrow Vaziri was a very polite, respectful guy that, he told his kids, every day going to school, say hi to the bus driver and say thank you and use your manners. So I think he was a naive, polite, respectful guy that went into this in the early 1970s, into the wrestling business that was completely different from everything that he was familiar with, and the business kind of ate him alive, right? I mean, it's a rough business. It was a rougher business, I think, back in the early 70s, and he's coming in the AWA, and that's where he starts out, and so you can see how he, maybe more than anybody in the book, and you and I could talk about this, Eric, whether it's Hogan or some of the other people, but I think that maybe of all the people, he became his character the most, right? Like he transformed into the Iron Sheik, so much so that like Khosrow Vaziri was kind of gone for a while.
How did and when did Kaz make the transition from AWA to WWF?
So he is first 3 or 4 years, he's going around the territories. He's bouncing. Vern sends him down to Florida. He goes down to Louisiana. He goes to Georgia for a little bit, and he comes back in like 1976. And he's he's wrestling as Khosrow Vaziri or Ali Vaziri. He looks like in those pictures, he's 190 pounds. And he's just not getting over, right? He's just no one's reacting to him at all. And yeah, I mean, he's just kind of a bland baby face. And so he's at the Olympics in Montreal in 1976, having dinner with Vern Gagne and his wife, Mary. And Kaz, he didn't really speak up that much for himself, but he was so frustrated that he said, "Hey, I want to turn heel." And Vern Gagne was like, "What? Like, no, you're not a heel." And he goes, "No, I need to be a heel." And that's when Vern's wife, Mary, says, "You should shave your head and grow the mustache and call yourself."
It's always the wife. It's always the wife that comes up with the best ideas.
Yeah, call yourself the Iron Sheik. And there already was the Sheik, Eddie Farhat, but she said, "Oh, you could be the Iron Sheik because your body's made out of iron." And so he had just gotten married like 3 months prior to Carol, and there's a picture in here somewhere of me and Carol, I think. And Carol is like in love with this handsome, tall, dark, handsome guy from Iran. 3 months into the marriage, he says, "Oh, okay, I'm going to shave my head, grow a mustache, become the Iron Sheik," and becomes this character. And then, yeah, there's me and Carol. And then he goes off to Kansas City. And this is where one of the cool things about the book is how these guys that I wrote about, their storylines all intersect with each other, right? And so he goes off and into Kansas City, and he meets Bob Remus, who was Sergeant Slaughter. But
Sure.
Bob Remus he was just becoming the Sergeant Slaughter character. So these two guys, he was going by Bob Slaughter and an Iron Sheik in the very beginning of their characters. They're in Kansas City together, and they got to be friends. They got to be really good friends. Like Kaz would go over to Bob's house, and his wife would cook him dinner. And Bob had a little girl named Nicole, and then Kaz ended up naming one of his girls after Bob's daughter. And so that's just so interesting because we all know, 7 or 8 years later, they're going to become the biggest rival.
Isn't that fascinating? I mean, I love those stories, and because when you're in the middle of it, and you got 10,000 people screaming and hollering and paying money to come and watch wrestling, you never think about how do these two people come together? What's their backstory? And here you've got two guys that Bob Remus, Sergeant Slaughter, grew up in Minnesota, broke into the wrestling business with Vern Gagne as well, and that's what they probably had in common. And I'm guessing she lived in Minnesota during this time, right?
Yeah. And so Bob came in, Bob is also one of the guys in my book, and he comes in a year later, and to the same camp that Sheik was in. And the story there, so Bob was a barber at the time. He wasn't in Vietnam. He was the original Brutus Beefcake. He was a barber in Minnesota before he was a wrestler.
Wow.
And a friend of his was doing a story on Vern's camp, and he said, "Hey, come along with me." So Bob goes to the camp, and Bob's a big guy. He's 6'5". He was an amateur. He did a little wrestling. He was a football player. And Vern says, "All right, we want someone to come in the ring so we can show you a couple of moves." And so Bob volunteers, and he goes in there, and he kind of holds his own with Ric Flair. And then Billy Robinson says, "Well, I'm gonna," Billy Robinson seems like he was kind of a dick, and he's like, "All right, I'm gonna show this guy," and he like basically screws up Bob's leg, messes it, hits him for real, really hard. And that was when, Bob got really pissed off and fought back. And then, Vern broke it up, and then Vern says, "Hey man, like you're good. Like you want to do this, come back next year and I'll train you." And that was a year later. Bob Remus comes in, and Vern trains him in the AWA. And so, yeah, so Sheik and Slaughter cross paths in 76 in Kansas City. That's how they get to know each other. And then they spread out again. Right. And then that's when Sheik really does the grind, where he goes off to Vancouver and Portland. And then he goes to the WWF in late 79, at the height of the hostage crisis. But he wasn't the Iron. He had a different name. He was the Great Hossein Arab when he went to the WWF that first time, for just a fairly short period. And he wrestled Bob Backlund in Madison Square Garden for the belt, and he lost. And then he went on with with his career. Looks like there's a question here, Eric. Who was Sheik's least favorite guy to work with, or favorite? Either would be good. He always spoke really, really highly. This won't surprise anyone of Backlund. He really, and that's, I think, why Bob agreed to drop the belt to Cause, was because they respected each other. They had wrestled each other in the AWA around 1977, 78. And it was Bob Backlund that came up with the angle to throw in the towel. And that was a way for Bob to save face by not submitting. And I don't know if you heard this, Eric, that apparently it was such a closed secret that a lot of the boys apparently thought that might have been a shoot back then when he threw in the towel.
I had not heard that. See, that's why I love this book. I mean, there's so many nuggets of information in there, and you're kind of a myth buster too, right? I mean, this book is about facts and the truth and the real story, as opposed to the fictional narrative that occupies about 90% of the vapor around the wrestling business. But
and here's the crazy thing about that. So we'll fast forward a little to late '83. So Backlund's been the champion for like almost 6 years, right? And Vince McMahon Jr. had bought the company in June of 1982. So, and the thing was, you got to remember, like, this is obviously way pre-internet. There's no, everything is, there's no communication around the country. And so no one even knew that for, all this time in 1982 and 83, that Vince Jr. was actually owned the company. Like, from all the outside world, all the other promoters, they still thought that Vince Sr. was in charge. They didn't even know that Vince Jr. was now owned the company. But of course, we know that, Vince in 1983 was making plans to take over, right? And so he's thinking, and in the back of his mind, Vince Jr. is like, he had worked with Terry Bollea with Hulk when he was there a few years ago. And I think for those couple of years, Vince was sitting on this, that when the time is right, I'm going to get Terry to come back to the WWF. And there's this story. I was able to track down the first editor of what was called Victory Magazine, the WWF's first magazine before WWF Magazine. And he told me that he was brought in the summer of 1983, along with a guy named Steve Taylor, who was a longtime photographer.
Yeah, Steve Taylor was around for a long time.
Yeah, these two guys were an editor and a photographer from a small paper in upstate New York. And Vince brought them in and said, I want you to run this new magazine. And what he did is he said he had these guys call all the promoters like Vern and Fritz von Erich. And he would say, hey, we have a new magazine. We want to feature world class. We want to feature AWA in our magazine. Aren't we so nice and friendly and giving you guys a push? And we're going to send a photographer and a writer. And so they would fly out there. These guys would have Vince's business card in their hand, and they would quietly slip Vince's card to the wrestlers, to the talent.
See, and I don't mean to interrupt you, brother, because it's rude to do that. I hate it when people do it to me, but this is another little nugget, because I heard when I went to work for Vern in 1987, and I was there for a few years, I had heard Vern's version, and of course then Greg's version of how that all went down. Yeah. It's decidedly different, but the idea that Vince had this master plan that perhaps he was sitting on for a while because he wouldn't want to let his dad know. I don't think this, again, I don't know this, but I've been told by enough people that I believe it. Vince Sr. probably would not have approved what Vince Jr. was about to do had Vince Sr. known he was about to do it.
That's right.
Jr. may have not have been able to buy that company. Right. Had Vince Sr. known, because Vince Sr. was very traditional, had a lot of respect for the other promoters. They had a good relationship. To send Steve Taylor and another photographer down under the auspices of, hey, we're really good people and we're here to help you. In the meantime, they're slipping him Vince's business card to snatch the talent. That's pretty.
And that is how they got Terry. So there was a show, I think it was at the Rosemont Horizon in like November of '83. And Terry was, this is Hulk, was back from, he was going to go to Japan soon. He was in a hot feud in the AWA. I think he would, maybe with David Schultz or with Bockwinkel.
Nick
Yeah. And so, so they send Steve Taylor, and Steve Taylor told me this in my research that he remembers. They sent Steve Taylor with Vince's business card. Well, first Vince calls Jim Troy, Steve Taylor, and Ed Helinsky together in the office at 81 Holly Hill Lane in Greenwich, Connecticut, and he says, "I'm going to make Hulk Hogan the world's first $1 million wrestler." And he laid out his plan. Like, here's how we're going to do it. And he said, "Steve, you're going to go to this show in Rosemont, Illinois, and you're going to give my card to Terry. And it's going to say, call me." And so Steve told me that they were, even though Vern let them come in to do their photo shoot, they were watching him like a hawk, the agents were. And he said he got up to Terry, and Terry whispered to him, he said, when you shake my hand, slip me the card. And so this is the level of like subterfuge that's going on. It's crazy, right? Like, because, back then everything, had to be done in secret. And then Terry calls Vince, and then this has been reported before that there's a secret meeting where Terry flies out, or Vince flies out to Minnesota, stays up all night talking to Terry about, here's my plan. We're going to put the belt on you. So
I bet they did stay up all night. You can read into that whatever you want, but there you go.
Yeah. And meanwhile, that's all happening. And meanwhile, you have Khosrow Vaziri, right? Who knew Terry, because they overlapped in 1979 and 80 in the WWF, and they were living in West Haven, Connecticut. And it's funny. Iron Sheik's wife Carol told me that Terry Terry couldn't figure out how to get to the arena, so he would always go over to her, and she'd have to take out a map and explain, okay, give him directions. This is well before he's met Linda. He's just starting out. After he was in Florida. And so and that's when Terry and Kaz, they got along, and they worked out together. But while Vince Jr. is hatching this whole plan, Kaz is down there in Georgia. He was wrestling in the Georgia territory, and he gets a call from Vince Sr. to come back to New York in late 1983, and he didn't know he was going to be the champion. It wasn't like whereas Hulk definitely knew the plan. Kaz was like, "Oh, I'm going back to New York. That's the best territory. I'm happy about that." And so there's all this, question about who was supposed to be the champion. Was it supposed to be Bill Eadie? Was it supposed to be Iron Sheik? Who was going to be the transitional champion between Backlund and Hogan? And so I actually asked Bill Eadie, because he's also in the book, directly. I was like, "There's all these rumors, let's do some fact checking. Were you supposed to be in the Iron Sheik spot?" And he said that Vince Sr., who was still booking Madison Square Garden at the time and kind of still in control pretty much, even though Vince Jr. was nipping at his heels. And Vince Sr. said, "No, Bill, I don't want to do that to you, because if I put the belt on you for 1 month, it's going to diminish you." And so there never was an actual plan, to put the belt on Bill Eadie. But that's where we get the Iron Sheik coming in.
Any idea why Vince Sr. decided to go with Kaz in that role?
I think it was because probably largely because of Backlund. Backlund really respected Kaz. They were both really successful, accomplished amateur wrestlers. The other guys that were heels back then, Don Morocco, the Mass Superstar, Bill Eadie. I'm trying to think who else would it have been, right? Ivan Koloff. I don't think any of those guys had the amateur credentials that Khosrow Vaziri had. And so I think if Bob was going to lose to anybody, he wanted it to be Kaz because of that respect for his amateur wrestling. And I have there's a photo I have here. When I went to see Kaz for the book, he still had the actual Persian clubs that everyone talks about, the Iranian clubs. They were right there in his bedroom. And so if Dave can pull it up, yeah, there they are. Those are the original, that's the Iron Sheik's bedroom the year before he passed. And there are his clubs still standing there. And he respected Bob Backlund so much that when he won the belt from Backlund, he gave a pair of them to Backlund. And I think there's that, like the A&E documentary from WWE, the Hidden Treasures thing. They actually go and they actually visit Bob Backlund at his house, and they find those clubs that are still there.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. If you've got questions out there, you want to join the show, that's why we're doing this, folks. We're doing it live so you can be a part of the show. Don't be shy. Don't be a biatch. Fire in a good question. Brad's got the answer.
So, there's a question here of, did the Iron Sheik get the recognition he deserved by the wrestling industry? And I think that, and I mean, Eric, you're someone that, because you never worked with Kaz in a professional capacity, right?
No, not at all. In fact, I met him once or twice. It was so brief that it probably doesn't really count.
Yeah. So, so you might be a good judge of this in the sense that, like, because you didn't know him, you didn't work with him, your impression of him may be, like a lot of people, I think, is like kind of stained by all the stuff that happened later, like the Howard.
Oh, because everybody always wants to talk about the bad stuff. That's why
Right.
that's why I dig this book, because you get to see the other side of the story. And you're right about that, man. The only thing I heard, I heard crazy Kaz stories. Obviously towards the end of his career, the drugs and everything kind of took over, and that's a lot of the narrative out there. But that's why I was asking you, man, what was he like away from the business, and what kind of a person he was? But no, all I've ever heard is really the negative, crazy stuff.
Right. And so I think that I think his legacy has been more of that character, that he sort of in his later years. And I think he is underappreciated for. I mean, he was a really good worker early in his career. Like, he was like a really, good wrestler, a good worker. He had a lot of really good match. If you watch his matches, like from the 70s and the early 80s. There was that question also about who he really hated Andre the Giant.
Really? Why?
Yeah, he hated Andre the Giant, man. He would just go off on Andre the Giant. And I think it's because, Andre passed a long time ago. I obviously had no personal experience with Andre, but from what I can tell, it was a hard life for Andre, because he was never comfortable. He was always just not fitting anywhere, and literally not fitting in an airplane seat or whatever. So I think from what I can tell, and he was a lot of pain. Like, Andre was really cranky, I think, towards the end. And I think he would sometimes wrestle, and he could be a little bit careless. And apparently, for some reason, he didn't like Kaz. And I think it was something about when they were in Japan, something happened there where he didn't like Kaz. So when they wrestled, they wrestled several times in 1984, and he would just, like, Andre would just like sit on him, and like there was one match where he kind of like threw him on his head. And he, really took some liberties. And Kaz was so upset that he goes into the back afterwards, and he told the agent, like, I'm not working with him anymore. You don't book me with Andre the Giant. And if you look at the record, sure enough, like, they didn't really wrestle much after that. And Kaz would say that when they would travel, and sometimes people would ask Andre for autographs, and he could be rude and say, get out of my face. And so I think Kaz always was really good with fans. Like, he was always good to, sign autographs and everything, even though he was a heel. Again, which is why, like, the version of him later on, was really sad, because that's really not who he was for, most of his career.
I want to go back, and trust me, I don't want to give the book away here, because there's so much in this book there's really no risk of giving it all away. But there's some really interesting points in there. And if I may ask, without giving away too much, I want to go back to Kaz going to WWF as that transitional champion as they're waiting for Hulk Hogan to arrive. There's the story that Vern Gagne, who had the relationship with Kaz, wanted Kaz to break Hogan's leg for leaving the territory. Can you dig into that and save a little for the book, obviously, because we want people to go out and buy this book and add it to their collection, because if you do collect wrestling books and you're interested in the truth and not the myths, this is a great one. But can you talk about that one a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So let's go back to Kaz wins the belt on December 26, 1983, and that is in Madison Square Garden. That's the card with all these guys that I wrote about in this book were wrestling on. And they do the angle where Arnold Skolin throws in the white towel so that Bob Backlund doesn't have to actually submit and quit. And now when he became the champion, Kaz, he didn't know how long he was going to be the champion, but kind of everyone could read the room when, here comes all of a sudden Hulk Hogan into the territory. They knew something was up. And so Vern Gagne calls Kaz and says, hey, you need, I trained you, come back home where you started. I'll give you $100,000 if you break Hulk Hogan's leg in the match.
Now this is 1983.
Yeah.
So without reaching for my calculator and doing the math, $100,000 in 1983 would probably be worth, I'm going to just guess, 700, 800 grand today.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. Yeah, it's a substantial amount. I mean, more than, well, I mean, there was a huge amount of money back then.
No doubt.
And so he says, so I'll give you 100 grand and you bring the belt to Minnesota. And there's been debate over the years over whether or not this is true, right? Like, is this just another wrestling story? And so the reason why I think it's true, so for one, Kaz, that story's been going around for years and it's always stayed the same. There's Tony Atlas had a great line to me. He's like, because Tony told me about the Bruiser Brody murder. That's a whole nother story. When he was there in the locker room, and he said, my story has never changed over all these years. That's how it's true. And it's a good point that if someone is lying for years, their story is going to change a little bit at some point. And Kaz's story has always been consistent on that. And then Terry, and I don't know, did you ever ask Terry about this, Eric?
No, I never did. Never have.
So, I've heard people ask Hulk about it, and he says that, he said, yeah, that's what I was told. I mean, as far as he knows, it's true. But the reason why I'm pretty sure it's true is that actually Sergeant Slaughter, Bob Remus, said that a couple nights before the January 23rd, 1984, that date that's forever in people's memory, when Hulkamania is born in the WWF, that Kaz went to Slaughter's hotel room in Pittsburgh. And this is, these little details are just what makes wrestling so fascinating. He knocks on Slaughter's door and he goes, Mr. Sergeant. Like, he actually called Bob Remus Mr. Sergeant when he was addressing. He said, Mr. Sergeant, I have a phone call from Coach Vern, Coach Gagne. He said, I should break Hulk Hogan's leg. And Bob Remus is a very smart, very thoughtful guy, and remember, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. This is where it all comes together. Who does Iron Sheik go to for the biggest decision of his life? But who is it but his biggest in-ring rival of his life, Sergeant Slaughter? Because in real life, in 1976, when they were in Kansas City, starting out, I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? That their characters were born in the same year, that Bob Remus became Sergeant Slaughter the same year that Khosrow Vaziri became the Iron Sheik, and that they both named their kids Nicole, and they're friends, and they're having dinner together. And here we are now, 1984, and Sheik is going to Slaughter saying, like, what do I do? Do I break Hulk Hogan's leg? And Slaughter says, no, man, like, you cannot do that because what's kind of funny, the brutality of wrestling. What's funny is in all of this, no one's talking about actually the idea of how awful it would be to break someone's leg. All they're talking about is like the actual practicalities of,
whether it was a good business decision or not, right?
I mean, poor Terry must be like, oh, thanks guys. Like, you're just going to assault me in front of 25,000 people and like leave me for dead in the ring. But Bob's point is that you're going to make more money staying here, wrestling in this expansion that we're about to get on this rocket ship with Vince McMahon. So don't do it. And Kaz listened to him, and sure enough, 5 minutes in, short match, drops the leg. Kaz does the favors, and then this is the thing, Eric. I remember when I visited you in Cody on my road trip, I asked you this, and I'm going to ask you again. That this is the moment after the match, they go to the locker room, and Sheik says, or Hogan said, "Sheiky baby, thank you, I owe you one." And that is the line that stuck in Kaz's head for all these years, that Hulk owed him a favor. And so there was some legitimate heat between Kaz and Terry, because Kaz claims that when Terry was in WCW, and this is where you come in the picture, Eric, that he called Terry looking for a job and that Terry never called him back. Now, I don't know. I wasn't able to ask, maybe you can ask Terry next time you talk to him if that ever happened, but I think you said you weren't aware of that, right?
No, I wasn't aware of it, but I've known Terry for a long time, and how do I say this gently? By the way, our buddy Efren, who's such a great guy, helps us out over at Every Show so much, noted here that $100,000 in 1983 is equivalent to $340,000 or $314,000 in today's money. Efren, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Clearly,
you got a real-time inflation calculator. I love it.
Yeah, that's awesome. But no, I never asked Terry that. But I can just say this, man, as long as I've known Terry and as close as we got and as much business as we ended up doing before we became good friends, like if I want to reach Terry, I know, even if it's urgent, and there were periods in time in our relationship where I talked to him 2 or 3 times a day.
Yeah.
But there were also times when I needed to get a hold of him, and let's just put it this way. I suck on the phone. I suck at getting back to people. I don't really like talking on the phone, but Terry's worse than I am. And a lot of times it's like, if he's driving or he's out, he's doing something, it's like, oh, I got to call this guy back. And that lasts for about 5 minutes and he forgets all about it. So I could see, knowing Terry and just the way he operates, I could see how that happened. And I could also understand, based on what I've learned from you and in your book, how someone like Kaz, that hurts.
Right. Well, so
especially if that guy says, I owe you a favor.
Well, you were asking me about like what is Kaz really like, and so because he was such a principled guy, like, to Terry that was probably just a throwaway comment in the locker. Oh yeah, thanks, man, right? But to Kaz, I mean, you got to remember these guys, especially guys like Kaz, even though pro wrestling was a work, and he knew that intellectually, emotionally, winning the WWF Championship really was like kind of winning the gold medal for him, right? And it represented this level of achievement that all he ever wanted to do in his life was be a wrestling champion. And if that means that in America it's pro wrestling, then that's the same thing as winning the gold medal. So and for a prideful man who is all about this goal, like, it wasn't a small thing for him to drop the title to Terry. And so I think that that's probably why that comment stuck with him for so long, right? Was that he really took it serious. He took it to heart. Like, no, I want my favor back. And, but here's a question, Eric, like, let's just do a little fantasy rebooking. Like, let's say it's 1994. And that's when Hulk came in. And what was your title in 94?
I've been in for about a year. I might have been a senior vice president by 1994. I don't think I had full control of WCW at that point.
Okay.
a shared responsibility, but I had a lot of influence.
Right. So let's say that Terry, let's just say Terry comes, hey, he says, stroking the Fu Manchu, right? Hey, Eric.
Hey, brother.
I got a call from Cause. And and he says, he wants to come in. Like, would that have been something you would have considered at that point?
Probably, because I brought along anybody else that Hulk Hogan wanted to bring into WCW at the time, for crying out loud. So, I guess it all depends, to be really honest about it. It depends how important it was to Terry. My perception of the Iron Sheik, of Kaz at that time, was pretty limited. I obviously about his career in WWF and all that, but I didn't really have a feel for what he was capable of doing in 1994. I would have been interested. I don't know that I would have bent over backwards, but I certainly would have been interested.
Yeah. Well, here's what I want to use. One of the things I do in the book, I try to paint a larger picture of some of these storylines where, like, for example, Iron Sheik, 1984, from Iran, right? Immediately, he's got to be a heel, right? It's like the way that the country was back then. Oh, you're from Iran, you're a bad guy. And so what now times have changed. We would never have a character like that anymore. But what I wanted to do in the book is provide some explanation for the reader of, like, why, so some of the context that it wasn't as simple as, or why it shouldn't have been as simple as, the Iranians took our people hostage, therefore anyone associated with Iran is bad. And some of the backstory that I get into in the book, and I know you like history, Eric, so hopefully you appreciated this, is that throughout the 20th century, the United Kingdom and Russia, they were meddling in Iran all the time. And in 1953, just as the first somewhat democratic leader was taking power in Iran, a guy named Mohammad Mossadegh, he was deposed in a coup by the CIA that President Eisenhower authorized, called Operation Ajax, and overthrew him and installed the Shah. So you can understand why, to some extent, Iranians developed a hatred for Americans that eventually boiled over into the Ayatollah Khomeini and the hostage crisis, because the United States had gone in and overthrown their leader, right? And
that's, there's another really salient point about this book and the history, and you do dive into that fairly deeply. You do a good job of educating the reader of what was going on between the United States and Iran prior to.
Right, and I bring it up also because now, fast forward, it's 1991, and this is shortly before my hypothetical about him going to WCW. Sheik is now 50 years old, right? And he's not in good, he's overweight. The drugs are kicking in. And this is, the epitome of, like, just preposterous thinking in that time. And then here comes the Iron Sheik looking exactly the same. And now he's Colonel Mustafa, right? And he's from Iraq. And so again, that really bothered Khosrow Vaziri. Like, I'm talking real, like a shoot. I remember being in his living room, and the thing that inspired the first line of the book, which is the Iron Sheik just threatened to kill me, was me pointing out to him that he was not the only Middle Easterner to be a successful pro wrestler, that the other one was General Adnan. And he got so pissed. He's like, fuck you. He's like, I'll fucking kill you, break your fucking leg. Because I not only did I challenge him, but I mentioned in Iraqi. And, there was one of the most brutal wars, the war between Iran and Iraq throughout the 1980s. And so the fact that Vince McMahon made the Iron Sheik into an Iraqi, like, whenever I would ask him about Colonel Mustafa, he would shut down. And it wasn't like that wasn't a work. That was like, it hurt him in a way.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
And I don't think that Vince probably had any idea, right? I mean, people say that Vince liked to screw with people with these gimmicks and everything. And, maybe some of it, yeah, obviously, if he's going to call, what was it? He's going to call Virgil and put Dusty Rhodes in polka dots. I mean, some of that is clearly Vince having fun, but, like, I don't think all of it was like trying to humiliate people. But I think that I think Vince saw an opportunity to utilize another Middle Easterner as part of Sergeant Slaughter's army. Right. But what he didn't think about was, holy shit, I've got, this guy who was a bodyguard for the Shah of Iran in 1968, who represented Iran in European wrestling championships, who, is a legitimate Iranian. And now I'm turning him into an Iraqi named Colonel Mustafa. And so that
Yeah,
really,
I don't think Vince had his geopolitical hat on.
yeah.
He came up with that one. I think that was just, I need an Iraqi. I need an Iraqi heel. Let's do that.
Right. But of course, again, back to the irony, right? And now you have him affiliated with Slaughter, but anyone who can see is like, oh no, that's the Iron Sheik and Sergeant Slaughter. They were enemies, and now they're buddies, and they're from Iraq, and they're different names, and it's just a little bit.
As Conrad Thompson would say if he was here, who booked this shit? Who did that?
Yeah. So I think, again, it's like what I wanted to get at in this book was the effect of this playing this character on you as a person, right? And I was talking about this with Chris Jericho recently, that wrestlers are maybe one of the only forms of entertainers when they sign their autograph that they sign their stage name, right? Like, you go to an actor or in any other line of entertainment, they're going to sign their real name. But you go to a convention, Eric Bischoff is Eric Bischoff, right? But a lot of these guys, especially from the era that I'm writing about, they're writing a different name, and that's just kind of an interesting thing when you step back and think about it.
It's actually really interesting and leads to, I think, some of the problems that manifest when performers do become their characters and play that character, especially in that era, the 70s, the 80s, and I'm sure, the 50s and 60s, but that was before my time really. But they were method actors, but they were method actors 24 hours a day, 365 days a week. And that's got to take its toll on your mental health at a certain point. And I wanted to save this till a little bit later, but it makes sense to ask the question now, because you are talking in this book is going to deal a lot with the myth and the reality and how playing this character sometimes affects people, good and bad. How much do you think the issue of the Iraq-Iran situation and perhaps being disappointed by Hulk Hogan because she believed for sure that he was going to get that favor back, it takes a toll on you. It can crush your hope. But how much do you think those types of things throughout that part of his career led to the drugs and the alcohol? Or do you think it may have happened anyway? Any idea?
I think that I don't think those were the primary drivers. I think what happened there is that Kaz was a very impressionable, naive guy when he got in the business, and as he says, and I believe him, what he wanted to fit in, right? So in the AWA, it was him riding with Dick Murdoch or Dusty Rhodes coming into town and saying, "Hey, Kaz, loosen up. The Olympics are over. Smoke a joint, have a drink." And then it really kicked in 1980 when he hit Mid-Atlantic, that territory in Charlotte. And now he's hanging out with Greg the Hammer Valentine, Ric Flair, Rowdy Roddy Piper.
Well, Ric Flair and Roddy Piper, if that doesn't do it, nothing will. If you can hang out with Ric Flair and Roddy Piper back then, and not end up in rehab or dead, you're a hell of a man.
Yeah, and that's what, his wife Carol said, that's kind of when things really started to get a little out of hand, was with that part of that territory. And then Kaz told me that it was Junkyard Dog that first showed him how to use steroids, and it was in Louisiana. So then he starts doing the steroids, and then I think it was the road schedule more than anything else in the mid 80s, that just 320 days a year, a flight every day, that just started to really break him down. And, people forget that how much old. So Kaz was, when he became the champion, he was 41 years old.
Which
So he was old to be, at that point. I mean, in WrestleMania 3, the show, we're all familiar with, he was the oldest guy on that show to wrestle.
wow.
And so he wasn't a young guy. And that was relevant in that his body was breaking down, especially with all the drugs. So I think then, you had the thing, and we can talk about this, the arrest with Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Oh yeah, I got to tell that story.
And that kind of really like set him into a spiral. And that just kind of ended really ended his big run effectively. Yeah, there you go. So here's the thing, Eric, that back to my thing about being a fact checker and all that. And again, I mean, I'm a fact checker because I actually literally was a fact checker at a magazine. That's where I started. So I remember in reading my research about this story when he and Hacksaw got pulled over in 1987, and they got busted for marijuana and cocaine and beer. And everything that I'd read said, there was on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that, these guys got arrested, and the front page of the New York Daily Post. And so I actually went to those newspapers and looked in the archives to see. And of course, sure enough, like the same way that wrestlers say that every show was sold out to the rafters, every night, it was not on the front page and all that. But the article that Dave just showed on the screen there was in the New York Post, right? And so that was a big deal that, these two guys are in-ring rivals, and here they are arrested together on the side of the road.
I'm sorry, go ahead, bro.
I was going to say what I got into in the book that no one's told this story before is that the Sheik was actually arrested 2 years before that at a gas station in Connecticut. And he was charged with assault because allegedly he smacked the gas station attendant. And I was able to actually track down his lawyer, who was this celebrity lawyer named Mickey Sherman, who defended him in both that and in the more famous arrest with Hacksaw. And Mickey Sherman told me that, and you can see this on YouTube. I'll find the clip and I'll put it on my website, where Mickey Sherman, the Iron Sheik's lawyer, actually goes and films a video of all these wrestler personalities like Classy Freddie Blassie and Captain Lou Albano giving a character witness testimonial for the Iron Sheik. But here's the craziest thing, Eric. They're in character in their testimonial. So you have Classy Freddie Blassie doing his voice and saying he's going to vote for the judge 5 times if he needs to. And Mean Gene Okerlund talking about how he met Iron Sheik when he was at the Olympics, and which is all not true, right? And they show this video in court. Like this is like a legal court proceeding, and this video is being introduced as like character evidence for the Iron Sheik. I mean, how much
like a sitcom?
How much more surreal can you get, right? And the judge liked it so much that he asked the lawyer for 20 copies. And sure enough, the Sheik gets off. I mean, that just goes to show you the way that the celebrity, none of these guys thought they were ever going to get in trouble, right? They were invincible. Tony Atlas told me about how, you didn't matter if you got pulled over, didn't matter if you were drunk driving. No one ever thought that the fun was going to end. And so, but it always ends, right? At some point.
It did. Yeah, I had the pleasure of, Hacksaw Jim Duggan was out here in Cody, Wyoming for a celebrity softball game and golf tournament. So I had Jim and his wife out to the house, and I was actually doing a radio show with Conrad that summer, like every Wednesday night or something, we do a radio show. And I had Jim, because Jim was here anyway for golf and hanging out the house. So I asked Jim to come in and sit in on this radio show with me, and I was going to interview him. And because I never really got to know Jim very well either. And we're riffing, and I'd had a couple beers before we sat down and do the show. And I led Jim into this story. So I'm hearing Jim's version of this story, which is really the first time I had ever heard it in detail. And what a crazy scene that was. What a crazy scene. Can you imagine?
Yeah, no. and these guys, Kaz and Jim were naive enough to think that they were going to get away with it because they got pulled over on the way to the show in Asbury Park, and they said, they brought in, I think they brought in the Sheik, and he had to get out on bail, and then they went to the show and they wrestled that night, and then like the next night, I think maybe the next day or 2 days later, and they were like, oh, maybe no one knows. Sure enough.
Yeah, maybe nobody reads the New York Post.
I mean, yeah, maybe. Then it's in the papers, and so someone asked in one of these questions in the chat here, like what was the most surprising thing that I found in the research, and one thing that I found really, so I was able to interview an Iranian journalist now in Tehran who had to use, we're so sort of spoiled here in the US with all of our freedoms and everything. Like we forget that right now, 2024 in Iran, they can't just go on to some websites, right? Everything is censored and restricted by the government. So this journalist,
we're not far from it. We'll be with the rate we're going, we're going to be there in about another 15 years or less.
Could be. So this Iranian journalist, he had to use all these workarounds to communicate with me, and he wouldn't give me his name on the record. He wouldn't let me say that, but he was really interested in Khosrow Vaziri, being from Iran. And what was interesting to me is he told me that that entire time in the 80s, when the Iron Sheik is huge, no one even knew who the Iron Sheik was in Iran. Like he was just, no one knew. Like they had no idea what was going on because they had no outside TV. There was no internet, and of course the ruling class, the Ayatollahs in Iran, were completely disgusted, thinking like, oh, look at this guy making a mockery out of our culture, playing this bad guy. And so this is what I say, like the irony is that that maybe Real American should be the Iron Sheik's theme song and not Hulk Hogan, because Sheik, he went back to Iran one time shortly after he left in the early 70s and never went back again, not even for his parents' funeral. And I think it was because he really became an American. He assimilated, he was persona non grata in Iran.
That had to hurt though too, man. That had to hurt him.
Yeah, no, but his family's still there, right? Like, yeah, it did have to hurt. But again, that's one of these things, like, again, the human side of these guys. What was it like to not ever go back, right? Never see your country again.
How tough was it on him, on Kaz, but also because you did have a chance to interview his wife and his daughters? How tough was the lifestyle on them? Did they adapt well? Was it easier for them?
On the family?
Yeah.
Horrible. Just, I think, I've never been married. I think to make a marriage work, you have to share responsibility, right? And there was no sharing. It was like Carol did everything. And yet, Kaz is the star, right?
Is that a cultural thing, do you think, or was it a Kaz thing?
I think that was just that was the boys, that, and I guess talking to Merced Solis, Tito Santana, right? He said his wife did everything, right? When he came back, he realizes now, because Tito has a couple of grandkids that are really young, and he's on, grandpa duty all the time. And he's like, oh, the day I went and met with him, he's like, man, I'm tired from like 2 hours with these kids. How did my wife single-handedly raise 3 boys? And so, yeah, the cost of the road on the family, I don't know how they endured that. Carol kept them together. And I think part of it is also like, and I got into this in the Wax Pack with the baseball players, like, what do you do when the only thing you've ever thought about doing, in your life for your career, you can never do it again, right? And that, I mean, wrestlers go on longer than baseball players, but once you're over 40, you're pretty much done in terms of really being able to perform at that level. And yet you have so much of your life still ahead of you, right? And so that's where I remember Carol was desperate. She was like, Kaz, you could drive a bus. You could go back to welding, because he was a welder when he first started out when he came to the US. And all Kaz wanted to do was something in wrestling, train, go to the gym.
And I think this is true whether you're a baseball player, a professional wrestler, a rock star, an actor, an actress. When you perform, especially if you're performing in front of a live audience, and you get addicted to that connection, because there's something magic about it. I was blessed with an opportunity to get a little taste of it. When you're standing there in the middle of the ring, in my case with a microphone, creating emotion, or in the case of a professional wrestler with the action that's going on in the ring, you're creating a reaction. You're the mastermind. I mean, you are the master of that domain, and you're doing things that are going to get the audience to react exactly the way you want them to react, exactly when you want them to react that way. It's a weird sense. I don't, power is not the right word, but it's a bizarre connection that you're not going to get it anywhere else. You can't get that. You can't go from being a wrestler to a brain surgeon, even if you had the ability, right? I gotta get back. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see guys who, even Ric Flair to this day, he's 70 some odd years old, and he still loves being out in front of that crowd. He can't do what he used to do. Nobody expects him to. But if he gets an opportunity to go out there and be Ric Flair, even if it's for a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, it's important to him. And I've seen friends that were close to me, some still are. Hulk, for example. I mean, when the surgeries got so bad that even he had to admit it's over, it's really, really hard, because like Kaz, like Ric Flair, like Roddy Piper, like Hulk Hogan, when you play at that level for that long and you've become that character over such an extended part of your life, losing that connection is losing a part of your soul.
Yeah, it's a death.
It is. It's
really
hard
is.
to explain, because people go, "Oh yeah, but you made all that money. If you're Hulk Hogan or if you're whoever, you made all that money. Why would it matter?" Fucking matters to them, man. That's their identity that they're having to walk away from in many cases. It's really hard.
Yeah, and I, you put it really well when you said that these are the world's most committed method actors, right? And it's so true that they were. I mean, again, especially, I'll be really curious, and I wonder what you think, Eric. Like the guys now, where maybe they're wrestling 2 to 3 days a week, and a lot of the characters now they're just extensions of their personality, essentially, right? They're their name, Cody Rhodes or Seth Rollins or whatever, and I wonder, like, what do you think? Do you think that if someone comes around in 30 years and writes the six pack about 2024, that we'll have the same issues that these guys I wrote about did?
I think some, because it comes down. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I even know myself as an example. I certainly didn't come up in the 80s and the 90s, and I wasn't a professional wrestler, but a large part of my life and my identity, and because I actually used my own name, it actually makes it more difficult, by the way, because you can never get the fuck away from it. But I didn't, it wasn't incumbent upon me in my role to make sure that I was in character when I was in a restaurant, or I didn't have to be in character if I met somebody out on the street. But I think when you're a Ric Flair and a Hulk Hogan or a Roddy Piper or a Kaz, name a lot of them, right? When you're at that level and you've become that character, it's hard to let it go. It's a death, as you said. But I think the difference today in the six pack that will be written 20 years from now, probably by you, and hopefully we'll be here on this YouTube channel talking about it. Somebody can prop me up, turn the thing on for me. But I think the talent today that are, the Roman Reigns, for example, he'll still miss that connection. But I don't think Roman Reigns, I don't think he hasn't become the character.
Right.
He doesn't have to become who's Cody Rhodes. Well, again, it's kind of Cody Rhodes, right? Cody Runnels, but Cody Rhodes. I don't think Cody Rhodes will go through the same type of loss as talent from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s did,
Right.
because it's not incumbent upon them to be in character and perform like it was back in the 70s and 80s, where you'd get booted from a territory. I mean, that was the issue with Jim Duggan and Iron Sheik. It wasn't they got busted for drugs. I mean, it kind of was. So, you know, it's kind of a bad vibe for the company, bad reflection. But what everybody was most concerned about is you had a heel and a baby face in the same car drinking beer. What the fuck?
Right.
That's what got him heat.
And what's interesting is, so I was thinking about this today, like everyone, we know that. So again, back to the fact checking, the storyline was always that kayfabe ended in 1989 when Vince testified or in court about, so the WWF wanted to be deregulated by the athletic commissions and not have to pay they didn't want to have to pay the whatever the charge is to be regulated by the athletic commission. So they went to court to try to get out of that. And as part of their testimony, they admitted that wrestling is entertainment, because I think it was the New York Times or one of the major papers reported on that court case. That became sort of fact that everyone said that's when Vince admitted that wrestling is a work. And so, but I was actually able to find that it was actually in 1987 when Linda testified at the Pennsylvania House of Representatives about the same thing. The only reason why no one thinks it's 1987 is because no reporters wrote about it. So again, it's just again how our history is often defined by whether or not a reporter wrote about something. But the truth is that kayfabe ended effectively in 1987 when Linda McMahon testified that it was entertainment. And I've read the testimony. But my point is that I was just thinking today, even though that happened and that sort of set everything in motion to where we are today, do you think, Eric, that it would have ended anyway, pretty much as soon as the internet came?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
So it's sort of like whether Vince did it or not, like we were on a collision course to end that era anyway.
Yeah, I mean, kayfabe, to the extent that it existed, 60s, 70s, 80s, prior to that, actually. Yeah, it was such an important part of the business. It was so protected. When I went to work for Vern in 1987, he wouldn't let me, on Tuesdays, when Vern would do what they called market specific promos, meaning he would fly talent in from all over the country and they would spend all day, sometimes two, cutting interviews that would get inserted into local syndicated television shows promoting whatever event was going on that weekend, right? That happened at least once every 2 weeks. That happened. When I first started, I'm working for the AWA. I'm doing the sales and syndication. I was not allowed on the side of the building where the production took place. I'm working for the company, but Vern was so strict about kayfabe. He was a carryover, obviously, probably one of the last of a dying breed by the late 80s. But even Vern, there was periods of time when I actually, before I ever stepped in front of the camera, I was running the camera. I was curious how to do that, so I learned how to do it. And then on those interview days, I was operating the camera. Now, this is probably 6 months or a year after I started. Vern finally let me into the production studio where I could see this all going on. But if there was a point in time where Vern had to have a conversation with the talent about how to put over his opponent or how to get heat during the promo, I was not allowed to hear that.
Yeah.
I was not allowed to see how the sausage was made. I could go to the counter where the sausage was served. I could go into the warehouse where the sausage was stored, but I was not allowed to see how the sausage was made.
Yeah.
Like I said, he was one of the last of a dying breed, but I think it would have ended anyway, whether it was with the internet or just really the expansion of the business.
Right.
The business got so big and so commercial that it was inevitable at some point.
Do you think that Vince's success is proof or evidence that he was in fact right? That because the traditional the narrative, the thought was among the promoters in the territories, right, was that if we let people know that it's a work, the business is gonna fail. do you think that like Vince's success is proof that actually, you know, they were wrong?
Look, giving any kind of props to Vince McMahon right now is politically so fucking incorrect. It's hard for me to sometimes talk about certain aspects of Vince McMahon.
Yeah.
But facts are facts. You know, what Vince has allegedly been involved in and done is pretty fucking horrible. It's a bad reflection on WWE. It's just a bad thing all the way around. I'm not trying to sugarcoat any of it. It's horrible. But you can't allow that to force you, or allow you, I should say, to just dismiss all the great stuff that Vince did. Vince was a visionary. Vince saw the future long before anybody would allow themselves to dream about the future of professional wrestling. With love and respect for Vern Gagne, if it wasn't for him, you and I wouldn't be talking right now. I wouldn't be sitting in this beautiful home in one of the most beautiful parts of the United States, in my opinion, at least.
Mm-hmm.
None of this would be happening. However, none of those guys would have been around 2, 3, 4, 5 years after Vince McMahon bought them out anyway, because they weren't willing to change with the time. Television changes. Every form of business changes. And those people that were so afraid of kayfabe, you know, and the loss of it, how it was going to, you know, kill the business, were wrong. Vince was right. Vince saw wrestling as a form of entertainment. The Bill Watts, the Vern Gagnes, the Bob Goggles, those guys, not so much. It was going to stay that little club that you had to fight your way into. And it was Vince's vision, I think, that allowed this industry to prosper. No question about that.
When we get into what part 4, our next episode is going to be about the expansion, about what Vince did. And
let's talk about, before we get to that, because we're going to probably wrap this up here shortly, but I got one question. Ask a Bum wanted to know, why does Eric think Meng keeps getting snubbed? I'm assuming that question is relative to the WWE Hall of Fame. I have no idea. You know, Ming's a well-known character that's been around the block and is respected by everybody in the business. I would imagine it's just a matter of time. It's not a matter of if, it's probably just a matter of time.
The real question in the Hall of Fame that I have, Eric, is why is Rick Martel not in the Hall of Fame? That one I can't figure out.
I was such a classy guy too, right?
Well, you worked with Rick, right?
I'm sorry?
You worked with Rick.
Yeah, a little bit. I ran into Rick about 2 or 3 months ago at an autograph signing. I think he just retired.
He did all this real estate stuff up in Canada, I think. And he's one of the few guys that has kind of been away from the business entirely. Like, you know, it's really hard to get him to do shows and stuff, from what I can tell. And I think it's because he really had the financial independence after his wrestling career to not really need that at all. Right.
And he didn't, his character didn't take over his soul. He didn't become Rick Martel, the model.
Right. Well, that's a great point, because maybe it's that. So here's my hypothesis. I want to run this by you, that the guys that I wrote about in this book, the one that I think became their character the least to me is Bill Eadie, the Masked Superstar, Demolition Axe. And I think it's because he was under a mask the whole time, or you never saw his face.
Right.
I mean, all of his characters, like the Mongol, one of the Mongols, and then Masked Superstar, and then Demolition, no one ever could recognize. I mean, he had probably the greatest job of all, because no one ever knew who he was.
Sting, look at Sting now. Same thing. Sting spent so much time in face paint, and now that he's finally, he wrote the last chapter of his own book. He put the period at the end of the last sentence of his career, and he could take that face paint off and walk through a mall anywhere in America, and no one will recognize him. And
that's right.
That's how you keep sanity, because you don't have to be on them, right?
Right. And to your point about Rick Martel, probably convenient for him that his one gimmick happened at the end of his career. Right. So, he was already Rick Martel well before he was the model. And, and then he went back to being, I think he was just Rick Martel in WCW.
Right. So what are we going to talk about next week? Because we're not just talking about talent here and following the stories of these 6 individuals that all kind of came together at Madison Square Garden back in 1983. This book has a lot to do with the expansion of WWF at the time. Tell us a little bit about what we can look forward to next time.
Yeah, so next time we're gonna really dig in. I was able to find a lot of the front office guys that have never spoken on the record before about that expansion. So Bob McMullen, who was the CFO of the WWF starting in 1983, Jim Troy, who was kind of in the Pat Patterson role before Pat. In 1982, he was brought in as the executive or senior vice president of Titan Sports. Tom Emanuel, who was the publisher of the magazine, Ed Raschuti, who was the editor of the magazine, Nelson Sweglar, who was the head of TV. And by talking to all these people, I was able to kind of create a portrait of Vince, so talking about Vince at that point in his career and what Vince was like, Vince Jr., and also myth busting around, where did the name WrestleMania come from? And did Vince really gamble all his money on WrestleMania 1? These were some of the things that I was able to do.
This could be a good one. This is going to be a good one.
Yeah, and I'm excited too, because next time we talk, the book will actually be out so people can have it in their hands. And
let's give a good plug here. I think Dave Silver, our super producer, who's backstage making sure all this shit comes together the way it's supposed to. We may even have some there we go. Pre-order now from thebradpack.com. Where's the book going to be available?
Yeah. So, as the cliche is, wherever books are sold, you can get it down to your local bookstore, Amazon, online. You can go to my website, thebradpack.com, and get it there. It'll be out next Tuesday. So the next time we chat, Eric, people can have it, and that'll be great because they could just, hey, Brad, on page 64, what is this? And we could actually refer to it. And the other thing that we'll keep talking about is, I have this great treasure trove of documents that I picked up in my research, including Vince McMahon Sr.'s planner from 1963 and 1970. It shows all the matches.
So will we be able to get a look at these on camera like we have?
Yeah, well, just like we did today with the Sheik stuff, we'll have Dave put some of those up on the screen.
That's awesome because nobody's ever seen that anywhere.
Yeah, and then people can actually go to my site, thebradpack.com, and they can actually, if you want to take a closer look and look at this stuff.
Oh, wait, there's one more thing I want to make sure I cover.
Yeah.
So here's my book.
Yeah.
Grateful, right? So Brad comes out to my house to talk to me about, doing a little bit. I think I might have been your first stop along the way as you were heading out to do your research for Six Pack. We're shooting a breeze. I probably had a beer or two. I don't think Brad joined me, but I'll drink alone. I don't care. And we're talking. I said, yeah, I got this book coming out and it's Grateful. And then you told me about this idea you had.
Oh, yeah.
So you have a QR code at
the
end of every chapter. I haven't looked for it now. And then so the reader can look at that physical book, see the QR code, take their phone, shoot the QR code, and then see an exclusive interview. And I asked your permission because I was so excited about the idea. And I was actually, I hate to say it this way, but you gave me your permission, so I don't feel too bad about it.
You did.
But I said, do you mind, if I do that, because I get to be the first book that we're aware of where you actually have a QR code at the end of each chapter where you get an exclusive interview with the subject of that deal. So you've got the same thing in your book, right?
Yes. Yeah. Got it. And that's like, like I said, that day we met, it's like, why that's not more common. It's such a great idea to have all this multimedia that could be available, right? So thank you for pioneering it, and I'm glad I was able to, do it myself in my book.
Oh, you made me look like a genius because when I'd go to conventions and people say, "God, did you come up with that idea?" I said, "Oh, fuck yeah!" I was out throwing a frisbee with my dog, and I went, "Hey, why isn't anybody that?" I always put you over. I always give you credit.
I'm your Larry Zbyszko of the NWO, right?
That's a good one, brother. Hey, Brad, thank you so much for this. Dave Silva, super producer. Thank you. I know I had a rough couple of days leading up to this. I got stuck in Denver and flights were canceled and I barely made it home. So I did not set this up the way I wanted to. But next time we do this, and we'll publicize it well in advance, we're going to get into some really good stuff. You're going to learn a lot about the WWF that you're never going to learn reading a dirt sheet. So if you want to be entertained and you want to be enlightened, you're going to come to the right place next time on 83 Weeks when we're going to get into the expansion of WWE. We're going to myth bust the fuck out of a lot of stuff that you've been thinking is true and have a great time. So, Brad, thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I really, you were so instrumental in helping me kickstart the six pack and get in touch with guys. I'm very grateful for that. And also for listeners or viewers, after that, we're going to do an episode on Terry, on Hulk Hogan. So that'll be another good one.
That'll be a good one too. And believe it or not, I learned a lot of, he and I have been, he's probably one of my best friends for the last 15, 20 years. And I'm learning stuff about him in the book. Anyway, we're going to talk a lot more about it next time. Thank you so much, Brad. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks.